I discovered the remains of my compost bin on a Tuesday morning when I stepped into my backyard with my coffee and nearly dropped the mug on my deck. The wooden structure I had spent 3 weekends building lay scattered across my lawn in splintered pieces. The rich black soil and decomposing vegetable matter spread everywhere like someone had detonated a fertilizer bomb. A bright orange notice was stapled to what remained of the largest panel, flapping in the April breeze. My name is Derek Ingram, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, for exactly 14 months when my life became a bureaucratic nightmare. I bought the house right after my divorce was finalized, thinking a fresh start in a nice neighborhood would be exactly what I needed. The place had seemed perfect during the showing, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a decent-sized yard and neighbors who waved when you drove past. Nobody mentioned that the homeowners association was run by a woman who made drill sergeants look easygoing. I walked across the dew-covered grass and pulled the notice free, my hands shaking slightly from anger rather than the cool morning air. The letter was typed in aggressive bold font and signed by Patricia Chambers, HOA president. According to the document, my compost bin violated Section 12.7 of the Community Guidelines regarding unsightly structures and presented a clear health hazard that attracted vermin and insects. The violation had been reported by multiple concerned residents, and the HOA board had voted unanimously to have the structure removed immediately for the safety and well-being of the entire community. Multiple concerned residents, I muttered, looking around at the privacy fence that surrounded 3 sides of my backyard. The only neighbor who could even see my compost bin was old Mr. Henderson next door, and he had actually complimented me on it last month while we were both mowing our lawns. This had Patricia written all over it. I had met Patricia exactly 3 times since moving in, and each encounter had been uniquely unpleasant. The first was at the mandatory new homeowner orientation meeting, where she had spent 2 hours explaining the community rules with the enthusiasm of someone describing medieval torture devices. The second was when she came to my door to inform me that my garbage cans were visible from the street for 17 minutes past the allowed pickup window. The third was 2 weeks ago when she showed up unannounced to tell me that my grass was 1/4 inch taller than the permitted maximum height. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number listed at the bottom of the notice. It rang 4 times before a clipped voice answered. Meadowbrook Estates HOA office, Patricia speaking. Patricia, this is Derek Ingram from 42 Oakmont Drive. You destroyed my compost bin. Mr. Ingram, good morning. Yes, the removal was completed yesterday evening by our contracted maintenance team. You should have received the violation notice at least 72 hours prior to enforcement action. I never received any violation notice. I came home from work yesterday and everything was fine. This morning my backyard looks like a crime scene. There was a pause, and I could hear papers shuffling. According to our records, the initial notice was placed in your mailbox on Friday afternoon. That provided you with 96 hours to address the violation voluntarily. When our enforcement inspector drove by yesterday evening and observed that the structure was still present, the board authorized immediate removal. What enforcement inspector? Nobody came to my door. Nobody called me. And there was nothing in my mailbox on Friday. I checked my mail every day. Mr. Ingram, I understand you're upset, but the HOA has clear procedures that were followed to the letter. The compost bin was in direct violation of multiple community standards. Several neighbors had complained about the smell and the insects it was attracting. It's a compost bin, Patricia. It's supposed to smell like decomposing organic matter. That's literally how composting works. And it wasn't attracting anything except earthworms, which are good for the soil. Her voice took on that particular tone that middle-aged women perfect when they are about to explain something to someone they consider beneath them. Mr. Ingram, when you purchased your home in Meadowbrook Estates, you signed a covenant agreeing to abide by all community standards and regulations. Those standards exist to maintain property values and ensure that our neighborhood remains one of the most desirable addresses in the greater Charlotte area. Compost bins are unsightly, unsanitary, and frankly, they lower the tone of the entire community. The bin was made of cedar. It looked nice. It was in my backyard behind a privacy fence. How was it lowering anything? The board's decision is final. If you would like to appeal, you may submit a written request to appear before the board at our next monthly meeting, which is scheduled for May 15th. Have a pleasant day, Mr. Ingram. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my backyard, staring at the destroyed remains of a project I had actually been proud of, feeling my blood pressure rising with each passing second. The compost bin had been working beautifully. I had been feeding it kitchen scraps and yard waste for months, and the bottom layer had already transformed into rich, dark compost that I was planning to use in my vegetable garden. Now it was scattered across 30 feet of lawn, and I would spend my evening cleaning up the mess that Patricia's goon squad had created. I called my lawyer that afternoon during my lunch break. Jennifer Katz had handled my divorce, and while that had been an expensive and painful process, she had been competent and straightforward. Her paralegal put me through after a brief hold. "Derek, how are you? Please tell me you're not getting married again already." "Nothing like that. I've got an HOA problem." "Oh no, those can be worse than divorces sometimes. What happened?" I explained the situation with the compost bin, the lack of warning, and Patricia's dismissive attitude on the phone. Jennifer listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. "Do you have your HOA covenant and bylaws?" "Somewhere in my closing documents, probably in a box in my garage." "Find them and read them carefully, especially the sections about violations, notifications, and enforcement procedures. Also, document everything. Take photos of the destruction, save every email and letter, record the dates and times of any phone calls or in-person interactions. If they didn't follow their own procedures, you might have grounds to push back. Can I sue them for destroying my property?" "Potentially, but HOA cases are tricky. You agreed to let them enforce certain rules when you bought the house. The question is whether they followed the proper process and whether their rules are being applied fairly and consistently. The destruction of property without proper notice is concerning, though. That seems excessive even for an aggressive HOA. So what do I do? Document everything, find those bylaws, and go to that board meeting in May. Be calm, be professional, and clearly explain why you think they overstepped. Meanwhile, I'll do some research on North Carolina HOA law and see what options you have if they won't listen to reason." "Thanks, Jennifer. Send me your bill. First consultation is free for former clients. Call me after the meeting and let me know how it goes." I spent that evening cleaning up the compost mess, raking soil and vegetable scraps into yard waste bags while my neighbor Mr. Henderson watched from his deck. "That's a real shame, Derek," he called over. "That was a nice setup you had. Did Patricia come talk to you about it?" "She came by last week asking if I had any complaints about smells or pests from your yard. I told her everything seemed fine to me. She didn't look happy about that answer." "Did she say anything else?" "Just that she was conducting a neighborhood survey about environmental health concerns." I figured it was more of her busybody nonsense. Woman's got nothing better to do than harass folks who are just trying to live their lives. I finished the cleanup just as the sun was setting, my back aching and my hands covered in dirt. 7 bags of perfectly good composting material now sat by my curb, waiting to be hauled off to wherever the city took yard waste. The irony wasn't lost on me. Instead of composting my organic waste on my own property and turning it into something useful, I was now sending it to a landfill where it would take up space and produce methane. But at least Patricia would be happy. The next few weeks passed without incident. I went to work at the insurance company where I processed claims, came home, made dinner, and tried to enjoy my house and yard without thinking about the HOA. I mowed my lawn exactly when it reached the maximum permitted height. I brought my garbage cans in within 30 minutes of pickup. I kept my car in the garage and made sure no toys, tools, or decorations marred the pristine beige conformity that Patricia seemed to demand. I spent my evenings reading through the HOA covenant and bylaws, which turned out to be a 78-page document written in dense legalese that made my eyes cross. But buried in Section 12, I found what I was looking for. Any enforcement action required written notice delivered via certified mail, giving the homeowner 14 days to remedy the violation before the HOA could take direct action. There was nothing about stuffing notices in mailboxes, and there was definitely nothing about a 72-hour window. They had screwed up. Badly. I documented this in a detailed letter that I planned to read at the May board meeting. Jennifer had reviewed it and suggested a few changes to make it sound less angry and more professional, but the core argument remained solid. Patricia and her board had violated their own rules, destroyed my property without proper notice, and I wanted compensation for the materials and labor I had invested in the compost bin, plus a formal apology. The first week of May brought unseasonably warm weather to Charlotte. Temperatures climbed into the high 80s, and I found myself running the air conditioning earlier than usual. That's when I started noticing the smell. It began as a faint, unpleasant odor that I attributed to someone's garbage or maybe a dead animal in the woods behind the neighborhood. But over the course of 3 days, it intensified into a thick, cloying stench that hung over the entire subdivision like a toxic cloud. It smelled like rotting food mixed with sewage and something else I couldn't quite identify, something organic and wrong. People started complaining on the Meadowbrook Estates Facebook page. Theories ranged from a broken sewer line to a deer that had died in the woods. Someone suggested that the water treatment plant 5 miles away was having problems. But nobody seemed to know the actual source, and the smell kept getting worse. On Thursday evening, I was grilling chicken on my back deck when I saw the first rat. It was a big one, easily the size of a small cat, waddling across my lawn with the confident swagger of an animal that had no natural predators. I stopped flipping the chicken and watched as the rat paused, sniffed the air, and then continued toward my fence line. "What the hell?" I said out loud. The rat was joined by another one, then 2 more. They emerged from the trees at the back of my property and moved through the yards like they owned the place. I had seen rats before. Living in Charlotte, you occasionally spotted one near dumpsters or in parking garages, but I had never seen them in such numbers or acting so bold. I went inside and checked the Facebook page. The posts had shifted from complaints about the smell to alarm about the rats. People were reporting sightings all over the neighborhood. Someone posted a video of at least 20 rats streaming through their backyard in the fading light. Another person said they had seen rats climbing on their deck furniture. A mother posted that she was keeping her kids inside because she didn't think it was safe for them to play in the yard. Patricia made an announcement on the page at 8:30 that evening. She had contacted both the city and a pest control company. According to her post, the rats were likely coming from the woods behind the subdivision, possibly attracted by food sources in people's yards. She reminded everyone to keep their garbage properly secured and to report any outdoor pet food or other attractants that might be drawing the rodents into the neighborhood. Unbelievable, I muttered, reading the post for the second time. There was no way this many rats were just randomly wandering out of the woods. Something was bringing them here. The pest control company arrived on Friday and set up bait stations around the common areas of the neighborhood. The workers wore hazmat-style suits and masks, which did nothing to calm anyone's nerves. I talked to one of them while he was placing a bait station near the entrance to my street. "You guys seen anything like this before?" The worker, a young guy probably in his mid-20s, shook his head. "Not in a residential area like this. Usually you get rat problems near commercial areas or apartment complexes with dumpster issues. This is weird. Any idea where they're coming from? The whole area behind your neighborhood is county land, right? Backs up to the landfill access road." "I think so. There are woods back there. Might want to check with the county. Sometimes when landfills have overflow or containment problems, you get population booms in rodents and other scavengers. They spread out looking for food and new territory." That made sense, but it raised an obvious question. Has the landfill had overflow problems? No idea, man. I just put down poison and collect the dead ones. You'd have to call the county solid waste department. I did exactly that on Monday morning, using my lunch break to navigate the automated phone system until I reached an actual human being in the Mecklenburg County Solid Waste Management Office. "Solid Waste, this is Robert." "Hi, Robert. My name is Derek Ingram. I live in Meadowbrook Estates off Highway 49, and we're having a serious rat problem. One of the pest control guys suggested it might be related to the landfill." "Which landfill?" "I don't actually know. Whichever one is closest to our neighborhood." I heard typing in the background. "Okay, looks like that would be the North Mecklenburg Regional Facility. Let me check the status reports. Can you hold?" Generic hold music played for almost 5 minutes before Robert came back on the line. "Mr. Ingram, thanks for waiting. So, I'm looking at the status reports for North Mecklenburg, and there have been some issues over the past month. They're dealing with a capacity problem because the new cell they were supposed to open in March got delayed due to permitting issues. They've been temporarily stacking overflow on the access lots while they wait for approval." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means there's garbage that's supposed to be buried and contained, but instead it's sitting in big piles waiting for a place to go. That can definitely attract rodents and other wildlife. The facility is supposed to be managing it with tarps and regular pest control, but if your neighborhood is seeing an influx of rats, that could be the source." "Is that legal? Can they just pile garbage up like that?" "It's supposed to be a temporary measure, and they're supposed to follow specific protocols. I'm not an inspector, though. If you want to file a formal complaint, I can transfer you to the Environmental Health Department. Please." He transferred me, and I spent another 15 minutes explaining the situation to a bored-sounding woman who took my information and said someone would follow up within 10 business days. I hung up feeling like I had accomplished something, even if it was just getting the problem on someone's radar. The rats got worse before they got better. By midweek, people were reporting rats in their garages, in their crawl spaces, and in some cases, inside their homes. A woman 3 streets over posted photos of rat droppings in her kitchen. Another family said they heard rats in their walls at night, scratching and squeaking. Children were no longer allowed to play outside without direct supervision, and several people started talking about breaking their leases or selling their homes. The neighborhood Facebook page became a war zone of panic and blame. Some people insisted this was a natural occurrence that would resolve itself. Others demanded that Patricia and the HOA take more aggressive action. A few people started pointing fingers at individual homeowners, suggesting that someone must be doing something to attract the rats. That's when Patricia posted about my compost bin. The post went up on Thursday evening, and I didn't see it until I got home from work and checked my phone. Patricia had written a long message explaining that the board had recently been forced to remove an unsanitary compost bin from a resident's property after multiple complaints. She suggested, in carefully worded language that was clearly meant to avoid direct libel, that decomposing organic matter in residential yards could be a significant attractant for rodents, and that the current infestation might be related to such irresponsible behavior. She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. Within an hour, someone had posted a comment asking which address had the compost bin. Someone else, probably one of Patricia's friends, had helpfully replied that it was the house on Oakmont Drive. By the time I saw the post, there were 63 comments, and at least half of them were calling me out by name and blaming me for the rat invasion. I sat in my car in my driveway, reading comment after comment from my neighbors, people I had waved to and smiled at and made small talk with at the mailbox, and felt something cold settle in my chest. They thought this was my fault. Patricia had successfully redirected all the anger and fear in the neighborhood directly at me. My hands were shaking as I typed my response. I kept it factual and calm, explaining that my compost bin had been destroyed over a month ago and had never attracted any rodents during the time it was operational. I pointed out that the pest control workers and the county solid waste office had both indicated the rats were likely coming from the landfill overflow situation, which had nothing to do with residential composting. I mentioned that composting was an environmentally responsible practice that was encouraged by the city of Charlotte and the state of North Carolina. I posted the comment and sat in my car, watching as the responses rolled in. Some people were supportive, saying they didn't think the compost bin had anything to do with the current problem. But more people doubled down, saying that even if the bin hadn't directly caused the infestation, it had probably contributed to making the neighborhood attractive to rats. Patricia herself commented, thanking me for my response, but noting that the board stood by its decision and that community standards existed for good reasons. I went inside and poured myself a bourbon, something I rarely did on weeknights. The stress was getting to me in ways I hadn't felt since the worst days of my divorce. I had moved here to start fresh, to find some peace and stability, and instead, I was being scapegoated for an environmental problem that the county had admitted was caused by their own poor waste management. The next morning, I found the first dead rat on my front porch. It was lying on its side near my welcome mat, clearly poisoned from one of the bait stations. I used a shovel to pick it up and dispose of it in a sealed bag, trying not to gag from the smell. Over the course of the day, my neighbors started reporting similar discoveries. Dead rats were turning up everywhere, on sidewalks, in flower beds, floating in decorative ponds. The poison was working, but the sheer number of dead rodents was almost worse than the live ones had been. A local news crew showed up on Saturday afternoon. They set up in the common area near the neighborhood entrance and interviewed Patricia, who had clearly prepared for this opportunity. She wore a professional-looking blazer and spoke earnestly about the HOA's commitment to resident safety and environmental health. She mentioned the compost bin situation again, in vague terms that technically weren't defamatory, but clearly implied that irresponsible residents had contributed to the problem. The reporter ate it up, nodding sympathetically and asking leading questions about the importance of community standards. I watched the news that night and saw my neighborhood portrayed as a cautionary tale about what happens when people don't follow the rules. The story was edited to make it seem like the rat infestation was primarily caused by residents not properly managing their yards and waste, with only a brief mention at the end about possible landfill issues that the county was investigating. Patricia came across as a concerned leader doing her best to protect her community. "Absolute garbage," I said to my television. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday, and I spent the weekend preparing my statement. Jennifer had helped me tighten the language and focus on the procedural violations, rather than getting emotional about the compost bin itself. The goal was to demonstrate that the HOA had acted improperly and owed me compensation, while also addressing the fact that Patricia was now using the situation to deflect blame for the rat problem. Monday brought a call from the county environmental health department. A woman named Sharon Kowalski introduced herself as an inspector and said she had been assigned to investigate the complaint I had filed about the landfill overflow. "Mr. Ingram, I visited the North Mecklenburg Regional Facility this morning, and I have to say, your complaint was absolutely justified. They have a serious problem out there." "How serious?" "They've got approximately 30 tons of unsecured garbage piled in the overflow area, some of it sitting there for over 3 weeks. The tarps they're supposed to be using are inadequate, and their pest control measures are basically non-existent. I observed significant rodent activity on the facility property, and given that your neighborhood is less than half a mile from the access road, there's no question that's where your rat problem is coming from. What happens now? I've issued a notice of violation to the facility operator. They have 14 days to either properly secure the overflow or move it to an approved disposal site. I've also contacted the State Environmental Management Office because this constitutes a public health hazard. They may decide to get involved at a higher level. Will this help with the infestation in our neighborhood? It should. Once the source is properly contained, the rat population will naturally decline. Between that and the pest control measures your HOA has already implemented, you should see significant improvement within 2 to 3 weeks. Is there any way to get this information to my neighbors? The HOA president has been blaming the situation on a compost bin I had in my backyard, and people are angry at me." Sharon was quiet for a moment. "I can issue a public statement through the county health department if that would help. We typically do that anyway when we identify a public health issue. I'll make sure it's clear that the source of the infestation is the landfill overflow and not residential composting activity." "That would be incredibly helpful. Thank you." "You're welcome." "And for what it's worth, Mr. Ingram, your HOA president is dead wrong about composting. It's an environmentally responsible practice that should be encouraged, not banned. A properly maintained compost bin doesn't attract rats any more than a regular garbage can does." I hung up feeling vindicated, but also exhausted. This whole situation had spiraled so far beyond what should have been a simple disagreement about yard structures. Patricia had turned it into a referendum on my character and my responsibility as a neighbor. And even with the county inspector on my side, I knew changing people's minds would be difficult. The county issued its public statement on Tuesday afternoon. It went out through their official channels and was picked up by the same local news station that had interviewed Patricia. The statement was clear and factual. The rat infestation affecting Meadowbrook Estates and surrounding areas was directly attributable to improper waste storage at the North Mecklenburg Regional Facility. The county had issued a violation notice and was working with state environmental officials to ensure the problem was resolved. Residents were advised to continue using pest control measures, but could expect the situation to improve significantly once the landfill overflow was properly contained. I shared the county statement on the neighborhood Facebook page with a brief comment noting that this confirmed what I had tried to explain in my previous post. The response was mixed. Some people apologized for blaming me and thanked me for following up with the county. Others doubled down, insisting that even if the landfill was the primary source, residential composting was still a bad idea, and the HOA had been right to ban it. Patricia herself didn't comment directly, but posted a separate message praising the county for their quick response and reminding everyone that the board meeting was tomorrow evening. I barely slept Tuesday night, running through my statement over and over in my head. I had printed copies to distribute to the board members, and Jennifer had agreed to attend the meeting with me as legal counsel. She said it wasn't strictly necessary, but her presence would signal that I was serious about pursuing this if they didn't handle it appropriately. The board meeting was held in the clubhouse at the entrance to the neighborhood, a small building with a kitchenette and a multipurpose room that was usually rented out for birthday parties and baby showers. When Jennifer and I arrived at 7 o'clock, the parking lot was already full. Apparently, half the neighborhood had decided to attend, probably hoping for drama. The multi-purpose room had been set up with a long table at the front where the board members sat, and rows of folding chairs facing them. Patricia sat in the center, flanked by 4 other board members whose names I had seen on the website but had never actually met. She watched me enter with Jennifer, her expression neutral but her eyes cold. We took seats in the 3rd row. I recognized several of my neighbors, including Mr. Henderson, who gave me an encouraging nod. The woman who had blamed me most vociferously on Facebook was sitting in the front row, her arms crossed, and her face set in a disapproving scowl. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7:15. She went through the standard opening procedures, reading the minutes from the last meeting and discussing several mundane items about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance. I barely heard any of it, focused instead on keeping my breathing steady and my statement organized in my mind. Finally, Patricia reached the section of the agenda for homeowner concerns. We have one scheduled speaker this evening. Mr. Derek Ingram has requested time to address the board regarding the enforcement action taken against his property last month. Mr. Ingram, you have 5 minutes. I stood and walked to the front of the room, Jennifer following to stand beside me. I distributed copies of my statement to each board member and then turned to face the audience. Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. On April 9th of this year, I came home to find that my compost bin had been destroyed by the HOA's maintenance contractor. The notice left at the scene indicated that I had been given 72 hours to remove the structure voluntarily, but had failed to do so, leaving the board no choice but to take direct action. I paused, letting that sink in. Several people were already whispering to each other. The problem is that I never received any prior notice. Not in my mailbox, not on my door, not by email or phone call. The HOA bylaws, which we all agreed to when we purchased our homes, clearly state in Section 12.4 that any enforcement action requires written notice delivered via certified mail, giving the homeowner 14 days to remedy the violation. The board did not follow its own procedures. They destroyed my property without proper notice and without giving me any opportunity to respond or appeal. Patricia started to speak, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. The compost bin cost me over $300 in materials and approximately 20 hours of labor to construct. It was a well-built, aesthetically appropriate structure that was fully contained and properly maintained. It did not attract rodents or create any health hazard. In fact, as the county environmental health department confirmed yesterday, the rat infestation that affected our neighborhood had absolutely nothing to do with residential composting and everything to do with improper waste management at the North Mecklenburg landfill. More whispers from the audience. Patricia's face had gone red. Despite knowing this information, Mrs. Chambers chose to imply in multiple public statements that my compost bin was responsible for the rat problem. She allowed me to be blamed and harassed by my neighbors for a situation that was completely outside my control and had nothing to do with my actions. This was not only factually incorrect, but also deliberately misleading. I looked directly at Patricia. I am here tonight to request 3 things. First, a formal apology from the board for destroying my property without proper notice. Second, reimbursement for the materials and labor costs associated with the compost bin. And third, a revision of the community guidelines to explicitly allow composting structures in residential yards, provided they meet reasonable standards for construction and maintenance. I returned to my seat. The room had gone completely silent. Patricia cleared her throat. Mr. Ingram, the board appreciates your concerns. However, I must correct several misstatements you have made. First, you were provided with proper notice. Our records clearly indicate that a violation notice was placed in your mailbox on Friday, April 5th, giving you until Monday, April 8th to remove the structure. When our inspector confirmed that the structure was still present on Tuesday, April 9th, we proceeded with removal. I never received that notice, I said firmly. And even if you claim you left it, that doesn't meet the standard established in your own bylaws. Section 12.4 requires certified mail. Section 12.4 applies to violations that may result in fines or liens against the property. Section 12.7, which covers immediate health and safety hazards, allows for expedited enforcement with notice provided by any reasonable means. A compost bin creating a public nuisance falls under that section. Jennifer stood. Mrs. Chambers, I'm Jennifer Katz, representing Mr. Ingram. I've reviewed the bylaws extensively, and that interpretation is questionable at best. Section 12.7 explicitly lists the types of hazards that qualify for expedited enforcement, things like structural damage, fire hazards, and violations of health codes. A compost bin doesn't fall into any of those categories. And even if it did, the bylaws still require notice and an opportunity to cure before direct action is taken. The board may believe it acted appropriately, but I would advise you that Mr. Ingram has a strong case for improper enforcement. One of the other board members, a man whose name placard identified him as Richard Morrow, spoke up. With all due respect, Ms. Katz, the board votes on enforcement actions based on our good faith interpretation of the rules. We believed we were acting in the best interest of the community. Good faith interpretation doesn't protect you from liability when you destroy someone's property, Jennifer replied. Mr. Ingram is being very reasonable. He's asking for an apology and reimbursement. The alternative is a lawsuit for property damage and potentially harassment, given the public statements made after the enforcement action. The room erupted in conversation. Several people were arguing with each other, some defending me and others defending Patricia. One woman stood and said that she thought the board should definitely reimburse me for the compost bin. Another person said that the board needed better oversight if they were just going to destroy people's property without following proper procedures. Patricia banged a gavel on the table, calling for order. "Ladies and gentlemen, please. The board will take Mr. Ingram's request under advisement. We will discuss this matter in executive session and provide a written response within 30 days. "That's not acceptable," I said, standing again. "You destroyed my property over a month ago. I've been blamed for a rat infestation that had nothing to do with me. I'm not waiting another 30 days for you to decide whether you want to take responsibility for your actions. Mr. Ingram, that is the procedure. The board needs time to consult with our own legal counsel and review the facts." Jennifer stepped forward. "Mrs. Chambers, I'll make this very simple. My client is willing to resolve this matter tonight if the board agrees to reimburse him for his documented costs and issues a public statement clarifying that his compost bin did not contribute to the rat infestation. If you're unwilling to do that, we'll file suit in civil court tomorrow morning. In addition to property damage, we'll be seeking compensation for emotional distress and reputational harm caused by your public statements. Discovery in that case will be very interesting, particularly when it comes to whether other homeowners have been allowed to have similar structures or whether Mr. Ingram was singled out." That last part was a shot in the dark, but I saw Patricia's expression flicker. Jennifer had hit something. "There are no other compost bins in the neighborhood," Patricia said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "Are you sure about that?" Jennifer asked. "Because in a lawsuit, we'll be entitled to documentation of every inspection, every violation notice, and every enforcement action taken over the past several years. If it turns out that other residents have had compost bins or similar structures and weren't subject to the same enforcement, that demonstrates selective enforcement, which is a violation of fair housing principles." Richard Morrow leaned over and whispered something to Patricia. She shook her head, but he whispered more insistently. The other board members joined the conversation, their voices low but urgent. The audience watched in fascination. Finally, Patricia straightened and spoke, her voice tight. "The board would like to take a 15-minute recess to discuss this matter privately." "Take your time," Jennifer said pleasantly. We returned to our seats while the board members filed into a back room. Mr. Henderson leaned forward from the row behind us. "You've got her cornered, Derek. I've lived here 8 years, and I've never seen Patricia back down from anything. She destroyed my compost bin and tried to make me the neighborhood villain," I said. "I'm not backing down either." The 15 minutes stretched to 25, and I was starting to wonder if they were going to come back at all when the door finally opened and the board members returned to their seats. Patricia looked like she had been forced to swallow broken glass. "After careful consideration, the board has decided to offer Mr. Ingram a settlement in the interest of avoiding costly litigation that would ultimately be paid for by all homeowners through increased dues. The board will reimburse Mr. Ingram the sum of $350 for materials costs associated with the compost bin. We will also issue a statement on the neighborhood website and Facebook page clarifying that the recent rat infestation was caused by landfill overflow and not by residential composting activity. Finally, the board will revisit the community guidelines regarding compost bins and other sustainable yard practices at our next monthly meeting." It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was close. "What about the apology?" I asked. Patricia's jaw clenched. "The board regrets any confusion or distress caused by the enforcement action and acknowledges that our communication procedures could be improved going forward. That was probably as close to an apology as I was going to get. I looked at Jennifer, who gave a small nod. "I accept those terms," I said. "Very well. The settlement agreement will be documented in the meeting minutes, and the reimbursement check will be mailed to your address within 10 business days. Is there any other business before we adjourn?" Nobody spoke. Patricia banged her gavel. Meeting adjourned. People started filing out of the room, several of them stopping to shake my hand or pat my shoulder. The woman who had been scowling at me from the front row avoided eye contact and left quickly. Mr. Henderson clapped me on the back. "Well done, Derek." That woman needed to be taken down a peg or two. Outside in the parking lot, Jennifer and I stood by our cars in the humid May evening. "You did good in there," she said. "I wasn't sure they'd cave so easily." "You think the selective enforcement angle really worried them?" "Absolutely." I did a property record search this afternoon and found 3 other homes in this neighborhood that have visible compost bins or similar structures in their yards. Want to guess who lives in those homes? Friends of Patricia. 2 board members and someone whose husband plays golf with Richard Morrow. If that came out in Discovery, it would be devastating for them. Not just financially, but it would probably result in a complete recall of the board. Why didn't we bring that up in the meeting? Because we got what we wanted without having to play that card. Always keep something in reserve, Derek. You might need to deal with these people again. I thanked Jennifer and drove home, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The check for $350 arrived exactly 10 business days later, along with a 1-sentence letter from Patricia acknowledging the settlement. The public statement was posted on the neighborhood website and Facebook page the same day, written in neutral language that carefully avoided any admission of wrongdoing, but clearly stated that the rat infestation was caused by the landfill overflow. The rats themselves began to disappear over the course of the following 2 weeks, just as Sharon Kowalski had predicted. The county had forced the landfill to move the overflow garbage to an approved disposal site, and the combination of that action and the ongoing pest control efforts brought the infestation under control. By the end of May, you could go days without seeing a rat, and the smell that had hung over the neighborhood was completely gone. The June board meeting included a discussion of revised community guidelines for composting. Several residents showed up to voice their support for allowing compost bins, including a woman who taught environmental science at the local community college and gave a passionate speech about the importance of sustainable waste management. The board ultimately voted to allow composting structures in backyard locations, provided they were constructed of approved materials, properly maintained, and not visible from the street. Patricia voted against the measure, but she was outvoted 4-1. I watched the vote from the back of the room and allowed myself a small smile. I built a new compost bin in July, this time using a design that was even more refined than my original. Cedar slats with proper ventilation, a latching lid to deter any curious animals, and a clean professional appearance that even Patricia couldn't complain about. Mr. Henderson came over to admire it and asked if I'd help him build one for his own yard. "You really stirred things up, you know," he said as we stood in my backyard with cold beers, admiring the new bin. "People are paying attention to what the HOA does now. Patricia can't just run roughshod over everyone anymore. I just wanted to compost my kitchen scraps." "Sure, but you stood up to her. That matters. Most people around here are too scared of violations and fines to push back, even when the HOA is clearly wrong. You showed everyone that these boards aren't untouchable." Life in Meadowbrook Estates gradually returned to normal. The rats became a memory, something people brought up at neighborhood barbecues with a mixture of horror and dark humor. The compost bin incident became local legend, the story growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling. I was no longer the guy who supposedly caused the rat infestation. Now I was the guy who had stood up to Patricia Chambers and won. Patricia herself remained HOA president, but her authority had been diminished. At the September board meeting, 2 residents announced they would be running for board positions in the upcoming election. Both of them specifically mentioned wanting to make the HOA more responsive to homeowner concerns and less focused on petty enforcement actions. Patricia maintained her pleasant smile throughout their speeches, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. The election took place in November, and both challengers won their races. Patricia remained president by virtue of her position not being up for election that year, but she now faced a board that was less willing to rubber stamp her decisions. The new board members pushed through several reforms, including clearer procedures for violation notices and enforcement actions, and a requirement that all major enforcement decisions be approved by a majority vote rather than being left to the president's discretion. I continued to compost, turning my kitchen scraps and yard waste into rich black gold that made my garden thrive. My tomatoes that next summer were spectacular, and I brought baskets of them to neighbors who had supported me during the whole ordeal. Even people who had initially blamed me for the rats eventually came around, stopping by to ask about composting techniques or to thank me for pushing back against the HOA's overreach. Mr. Henderson and I became good friends, often having beers on one of our decks and talking about everything from sports to politics to the latest neighborhood drama. He told me that in all his years in Meadowbrook Estates, he had never seen Patricia face any real opposition until I came along. "You changed this place," he said one evening in late December as we watched snow begin to fall on our quiet suburban street. "For the better." I thought about that statement later as I sat in my living room with a fire crackling in the fireplace. I had moved to this neighborhood hoping for a fresh start, a peaceful place to rebuild my life after my divorce. Instead, I had found myself in a fight over something as simple and reasonable as a compost bin. But in fighting that battle, I had learned something important about community and about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. The compost bin was still there in my backyard, faithfully turning my organic waste into something useful and valuable. It had cost me time, money, and stress to defend my right to have it, but looking back, I wouldn't have done anything differently. Some things are worth fighting for, even if they seem small to other people. Patricia Chambers continued to live 3 streets over, still driving around the neighborhood in her pristine white SUV, still attending every board meeting, still enforcing rules with the same rigid dedication. But she had learned that there were limits to her authority, and that homeowners had rights that couldn't simply be trampled in the name of community standards. As for the rats, they never returned in those numbers. The county had implemented better oversight of the landfill operations, and the overflow problem that had caused the whole crisis became a case study in what not to do. Sharon Kowalski, the environmental health inspector, even mentioned the incident in a presentation she gave at a public health conference, using it as an example of how improper waste management could create cascading problems in nearby residential areas. I occasionally thought about how different things might have been if I had just accepted the destruction of my compost bin and moved on. I could have avoided the conflict, the stress, and the public confrontation. But I also would have tacitly accepted that the HOA could do whatever it wanted without accountability. Sometimes the right choice isn't the easy one, And sometimes fighting back against petty tyranny is exactly what a community needs. My vegetable garden flourished in the years that followed, fed by the rich compost from my bin. I expanded it each season, adding new beds and trying new crops. Neighbors would stop by to admire the tomatoes, peppers, and squash, and many of them started their own gardens. A few even built their own compost bins, following the guidelines that the board had established after my victory. The neighborhood changed in subtle ways. People seemed more willing to question the HOA's decisions and to push back when rules seemed arbitrary or excessive. The board became more transparent, posting detailed minutes from meetings and creating a suggestion box for residents to submit ideas for community improvements. It wasn't a revolution, but it was progress. In the end, my fight over a compost bin became about something much larger than yard waste and HOA regulations. It became about the right of homeowners to make reasonable decisions about their own property. It became about holding elected boards accountable to the people they supposedly serve. And it became about the importance of truth, especially when those in authority try to manipulate facts to serve their own agendas. I still live in Meadowbrook Estates. My house is still a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a decent yard. But now that yard includes a thriving garden, a well-maintained compost bin, and the satisfaction of knowing that I stood my ground when it mattered. Patricia Chambers is still the HOA president, though her term expires next year and there's already talk of someone running against her. The rats are long gone, nothing but an unpleasant memory and a cautionary tale about landfill management. And every time I harvest vegetables from my garden or turn the rich compost in my bin, I remember that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can make the biggest difference. The system isn't perfect, and people like Patricia will always exist, trying to impose their vision of order on everyone around them. But when ordinary people stand up and demand accountability, when they refuse to accept injustice even in small matters, real change becomes possible. That's the lesson I learned from my fight over a compost bin. That's the story I tell when people ask me about the time the HOA destroyed my property and tried to blame me for a rat invasion. And that's the truth I hope more people will understand, whether they live in Meadowbrook Estates or any of the thousands of other neighborhoods across America, where HOAs wield power without always accepting responsibility. The compost bin sits in my backyard, a simple structure of cedar slats and wire mesh, turning waste into something valuable. It's just a bin, really, nothing special or remarkable. But it represents something more, a small victory in a larger struggle, a reminder that even in the face of bureaucratic arrogance and institutional power, individuals can still make a difference. And that's a truth worth composting into something rich and fertile, something that can help new ideas grow and flourish in communities everywhere.